So we've actually seen three hooks: use state, use effect, and use reducer so far. So there is another hook which is very useful in form input handling called useRef. So that we will see today. So let's start our application with npm start. Let's go inside React, my React. Npm start. What's this one? So far, we have seen simple HTML like this. What about forms? How do I handle forms? In simple HTML, we could do it something like create a form like this, form element, something like that. Before doing that, let's remove everything that we have done so far. So we'll just remove this and all of it. In simple terms, if I want to create a simple form, let's say with an input and color input, I'll just create a form element like this. Let's put some input element, text element, something like type equals text. If we do, we create an input element, text element, text input. This is text input. So this is a text input. So whenever I submit this enter, it will actually send to a specific URL. So that URL, expectancy, we go to the network tab. Whenever let's do one submit button also here. So button type equals submit. Submit. If I type something here and to submit, it's going to send a request to the specific URL, just like this. So request URL, it has sent with the get request. Suppose if I want to send it to a specific URL, I would actually do it with form action. If I say action equals, let's say I will do submission.php. If the backend is written in PHP, you could actually send it to that URL. Now, if I do submit, it will go to this particular URL. So by default, it is going to sending a GET request, but we can specify what kind of method we want to use. Method, if I do post, whenever I submit something, it will do a post request to this URL. If you see the details of the request, it's going to this particular URL and then using the post method. So this is the basic working of a form. So what about what if you want to handle scenario where you want to read this particular text input? So how does React know if something, let's say before submitting, I want to validate this input or do some manipulation, or if I don't want to use their HTML actions, if I want to do AJAX request, AJAX means asynchronous JavaScript, asynchronous XML. So that kind of scenarios, instead of letting the browser do the submission, if we have to submit to this kind of approach works when we have URLs separately. Let's say form submission. If I inspect this and let's say go to the body, request headers and form data, you can actually see the body of this. It's expand and see that. These are the headers, response headers, request headers, and if there is any body, it would come here. We are not sending any body here. Form data we should send. So this is defaultly handled by the browser. So in the middle of it, if I have to intercept with JavaScript and validate some of these fields and do specific actions based on the field values, we can actually do it with a specific action. Instead of doing this action here, you can actually override this methodology with on submit event. So on submit event, we have to call a specific function. So let's say I will do my sub function or submit function. I'll just name it as submit. And this submit is a function that we have to implement. Let's do function submit, and this is going to be accepting an event in, and let's say do something like console log of e. But this does not prevent the browser from sending the request to a specific URL. Let's say now I have opened the console. I say something, I submit, and actually it printed and went away because the network navigation scene, there was a request that went as soon as the submission happened. So it actually called the submit function and also had done a request to a specific URL. Because we haven't specified a URL, it's going to this question mark URL. If you see here, there was a request that went to the URL. So defaultly, the HTML page is doing that action. If I don't want that to happen, I can actually do one thing. On this submit handler, we can prevent the default action. The default action is submit. Whenever submit button is clicked, you send a request to a specific URL. If I don't have an action here, it will send it to something like this, same URL. If I don't want that to happen, I can actually prevent that with event dot prevent default. If I do this, next time I submit, let's go to slash, I fill in some data, let's clear this before anything happens. So go to console to submit. It actually prevented, it did not go to that question mark URL. If we go to the network tab and we don't see any post request or get request going here, because we actually prevented that event from taking the default action, which is going into a specific URL or submitting that data to a specific URL. So instead, what we are going to do here is we are going to submit the data from this submit function rather than letting browser handle that submission. So this will allow us to validate the data before the submission happens to the backend server. So this is intercepting the submission events. So when do we need this, or how do we know that this value, if I want to validate specific data that is coming in this particular input, how do I get this value? I can see the event object. If I expand this event object because I logged it, we have target and we have input and values. So input has value. event input has value. So this actually depends on the order in which we have specified. Target will have target 0 is an input and target 1 is a button. This is more complex to handle. If I have to specifically get this value and validate it, I would have to get the index, like what's the number of which is the input. So this is the 0th index and this is the second index. I have another input called, let's say, type as I will use color. This actually opens up a color box, color selector. So if I now submit and see the event expanded, target form has three targets. First is the text input, second is the color input, and third is the submit button. So this is kind of difficult to manipulate. Let's say if I have to validate this, I will have to get um, console loglets to e dot dot target of 0 dot value. This will give the value of the text input. By submit, this will give the value of the text input. But we have to exactly know what's the index. If I, in the future, if I add another input about this, let's say this one I have added, this will actually break the entire logic that we implement. So for this purpose, we need to specifically identify each of these individual inputs with a specific reference. So that's where use reference will help us. So let's remove this and import useRef from React. So what useRef will do is we will create a reference to reference a specific input element. Let's go create a constant called, let's say, sound. Let's say this input handles sound and we create sound as a reference and we will make this input refer to sound. If I see ref equals sound, basically what it is doing is this input object is being referenced by this sound variable. This is a reference object. So whenever I try to access sound object, it will refer to this particular input element. Let's go create this above here. So let's move the submit also into this. So within functions, we can define functions. This is another advantage of JavaScript. So within this submit, we can actually refer to this sound object. By now, to prevent default, this is required every time we want to override the functionality for submissions. We need to keep this prevent default. Instead of this, let's do console log of sound. This input refers to sound. Let's do a submit. And this sound object is now having one current input. Current variable refers to input. Current has a specific set of properties. There is something called value also in this property. Let us more and expand and see. If you see value must be current dot target one. So should be current value. Yeah. So this sound has current variable, current has value variable. If I want to access this value of this input, I can actually do it with sound dot current dot value. So even if I add one more input here at a later point, we won't break the code. If I submit something here, this input reference always refers to this input element. Sound reference will always refer to this input element. So this is how we avoid errors. And now let's do the same thing with color input and create a new useRef. UseRef is just a pointer to a specific element. If I want to make sure that an element is correctly identified at a later point, and we want to refer to this input element or any other HTML element, we can use useRef. Now, as soon as I submit, let's take the value from, let's define sound value as sound.current.value. Similarly, color value will take as color.current.value. Any number of inputs, if we add, we can add one reference to it. And there is also another approach using the state variables and context variables. We'll discuss that sometime. So now that we have these values extracted, we can do some alert just to demonstrate and use these values in our JavaScript code. Sound value, color is color value. Now let's say I, and we'll select some color. Press submit. I's color is this, whatever we selected from sound value, which is input, and this color value, we are able to use it. So here, instead of alerting, we can actually do a post request or fetch post request. Send a request to the server, something like that. We can do anything we want. Or if there is some validation errors, we can just return it with setting some error values. Let's say if I want to show some error, we can actually do it with let's define some constant here, error, set error, or validation error, set validation error equals use state. Let's say I'll use none here. Let's import the state. In this place, let's set this validation error as your data is null. So always it's going to, whenever I submit, it's always going to set the validation error. And if there is some validation error, we can show that validation error here. If there is, then we will do this, otherwise we will not do it. Let's do double ampersand means if this is true, then only execute this statement. We will just use the same value here. This validation error will be shown only when this is not null or true. Let's do something. Submit. Okay, and we can see that here. This is how use reference will work. So just like this, we can actually make use of use state instead of useref. Useref is one way to do it. And if I want to handle all submissions with use state, we can do that too. So instead of this useref, we will just replace this entire thing with use state values. Sound and set sound. Let's do this. Use state and initial value. Let's put it as empty. And similarly, we will use color and set color. So initial color, I will set it to black. So one subtle difference is instead of ref, we have to use value here. Value is going to be sound and here value is going to be color. So this color value is a string and this sound value is also a string, which is empty string. And here we have to use sound directly. We don't have to extract it from the element because this value is set by the element. But in order to get that, we have to actually set sound and set color within this element. Whenever somebody adds this, so if I leave it just like this, if I'm typing down here, it's not able to put anything because always the value is being set to the initial value. Upon changing, we have to set this value in order to reflect that. For doing that, we need to handle onChange event. OnChange, what we want to do, whenever some change happens on this input element, I have to extract that value. So this will accept a function that will do, let's say E as the event that it receives. So this event, let's say when I type something into the text field, that is actually an event, E in event, E input event. So that event will get received in this, and I'm going to extract that E dot target dot value. If I do, that's going to extract that value what I type. And this value I'm going to use to set the set sound, call the set sound function. If I do this, what this means is whenever the change happens on this input element, take that target event and get the value of the event, which is this target actually means refers to this input element. This input element's value is going to be the new data that we typed in. So that's going to be set under sound variable. Now let's type it down. If I type down anything, the value now is going to be the new value. And similarly, for this input also, we have to do same thing, except that it is going to be set color instead of set sound. So now whenever I change something, that also gets changed. And here we still need to keep this event default and we don't need this kind of approach. Now we need to do use sound directly and color directly. Let's remove this error also. And this also. And remove this as well. Now if I submit something that says that is using use state. So we have seen two approaches. One is using reference. We get the with using reference, we actually get the value after submitting to the target current method. And if we are using use state, we are going to do override this on change event. Whenever some change happens on this input, we are going to change that value here. And we have on the submit, we have all the values ready made for us. These are two different approaches for handling form inputs. And just like this, we can also override this. This is kind of a routine approach, right? Every time we have a new input element, we have to do this on change event. All this we have to do. So there is a convenience we can convenience method we can do. So we can actually override or create our own custom hooks. That is called like hook is nothing but a utility function. So all this functionality we can extract into one simple utility function and call it a use input hook. Use input hook is not there in React, but we are going to implement our own custom hook with the name use input. So let's create our own custom hook called use input.js. So in this, what we are going to do is we are going to use use state. So this is a routine approach. We have for every input element, we need one state variable to store that value. And whenever on change happens, whenever change happens on that input, we need that value set to that particular uh, state variable. This is a routine approach for every input that we add. So that we are going to extract into our own hook. So here I'm going to import use state from paint. Now export function use input, and this is going to return something. So if we see use state, it actually returns an array of two elements. First element is the value state value itself, and second element is the function that sets that state. Similarly, we will have two values returned from use input. First is going to be the value of a input element, and then second is going to be this on change event. So basically what we made is we are actually trying to override this input with this value, and on change we are going to extract into a separate hook. So this value is going to be coming as a return value, and on change also is going to be coming as a return value. So this what it does is, so it accepts an event. You see here, the same thing we are extracting into a separate function here. And set value. So this value is going to be used as a state variable, just like this. Use state. So initial value, we will come back to it later. Initial value, let's take it as null for now. So first argument, first return value is the properties. Yeah, set value of e.target dot value. This functionality, entire these two properties, we have extracted into this particular object. And let's say use input has an initial value, accepts an initial value. And that initial value we are going to use for the value. And now we have first object returned. And let's do second object. Second object actually clears the input. You see here, this actually does not change anything. So after submission also, this specific data is still remaining. So in order to clear that, we actually need to After submission is done, set sound empty and set color default value. I do this, it will clear those elements. If I do something like this and submit, as soon as submission is done, it will clear those inputs. This is a clear uh, functionality. So this clear functionality also we will want to extract into our user input. Let's put that also here. So second argument or second return value is going to be another function that is a clear function. Set value for this value as initial value. So with this, actually what we can do is when we do use input, it accepts an initial value and returns two objects. One is the value or input object, input object props, let's say. These are the properties we extracted from here. This value and this constant we extracted into use input object properties, and let's say this another one is dataset properties. This is a function. This is the function. This is the way we will be using use input in any other place. Now let's refactor our this code with use input. Instead of doing everything here, we'll just import that use input, import use input from dot slash use input. Let's create something like this. Once, so props, and we set some fade. We'll use input. This will accept the initial value as empty. Now, instead of this state variable we are going to use, we'll just remove this and remove this and use the sound properties here. We can actually do value equals sound props dot value, and we can use on change equals sound props dot on change. So what this gives us, use input has first argument, the first value, return value, which is an object that has value property and on-chain property. This actually means this an advanced JavaScript greeting. This actually means value colon value. If I don't specify actually, the variable name itself will be used as the key of the object. This is a shorthand. This we can eliminate with just using this. When I return an object without a key here, this assumes the property name as the variable name itself. Actually, this is something like value equals value and constant equals this. So I just eliminated this and used it. This is a JavaScript property. So now we have value and on change. So there is one convenient approach here. We only have two values here. The sound props is going to return this thing, and value and on change, we can actually use it all in one shot. Instead of using it this way, I can use it like this. Object deconstruction. This is called object deconstruction. Sound props. we should use it like this. Not like this. I'll use it like this. This is called object deconstruction. This actually means this value equals this, unchange equals this. That's what this means. We can eliminate this instead of doing this approach. This is one approach, and this is even shorter approach. So all the values will get extracted into this input with this. Similar to sound properties, we will have color properties. And use it here instead of this value and unchanged. We're going to use that. We can remove this part and remove from here and get the values. This. So we'll remove this, and on submission, we are going to use soundprops dot value, color props dot value. How this works is whenever on change happens, whenever somebody changes this input, and this soundprops on change function gets called, and that will set the new value to that value. So if I get that value from soundprops, that's going to have the latest value. And after this preset, we will use it with this preset sound. We don't need to pass any argument because the initial value that passed will be taking effect. So for the color, we will set the initial value as black. And similarly, for color also, we will reset. We don't need to pass any arguments to this because it will by default take the initial value that we used. This is much shorter using our custom using tool. I can do something there, change the color. Okay. It all works the same way, except that now we don't have to override the on change in every single input element. We have extracted that into one custom called use input, and wherever we want that functionality, we can use that and use it like this. So this is creating custom code. So there are situations where, next thing is, there are situations where you have child elements where you need to pass in all these state variables or these functions that manipulate these state variables. So as you go down the hierarchy, there can be hundreds of children and there can be multiple levels of children, grandchildren, and so on. So if you want to pass it into all those, we have to pass it into every single child of every single level. That's very complex. It easily becomes unmanageable. For that purpose, we have another group called use context or create context. So basically, use context is the hook, and create context is a way to create a context object. So basically, an application or a part of the application can have a specific context to it. So all the state variables, all the functions manipulating those state variables can be stored in that context object. So let's see how to use that context object. Let's import create context from there. Let's remove all this. And simply we will return from here some division as well as trace And, here's some kind of example. We are going to pass in a set of trees. We define some set of trees. These are like objects. ID, type, let's say maybe we will need one or more objects. Let's, let's make this as strings. And let's make this one as a tree. Let's say family tree and come. So this tree constant, this array is available within this component. But if I have a child, I won't have that trees object available to it. Unless I do an export of this, it won't be. So if it is a dynamic value that is calculated, that there is no way to pass it down to children without passing it in the arguments or properties. Let's create a context and store this object trees array in that context object. Let's create const trees context, create context. This creates a context object that we can use it in the entire application. In order to use that, we have to use wrap the element or entire application or part of the application. Right now, this context, I'm going to use it in the entire application. If a specific context, if you don't want it to be available to every component, we can actually create it and wrap it under a specific element. So, but now I want this context to be available across the entire application. So I'm going to remove this. It's not strictly necessary. This is only a wrapper. You can wrap it inside here also. Well, but for simplicity sake, I'm going to remove this and replace it with case context dot provider. Basically, whenever we want to use context object, we need to wrap that under provider element with the same name, is provider dot this context dot provider. Okay, choose context. Okay, we haven't exported it, but it works because we are using it within the same uh, file. It will work. Now let's do one thing here. So let's extract this app component into a separate file. So basically, this context object, even though we want to access the screens, we can actually access it directly. So, but the use case that we are trying to solve is how do I pass this trees object across different elements or components. So, for demonstrating that, let's extract this function app component into our app.js. We replace it with app.js here. Replace it. And let's import this app into index. Import app from app. App.js has to have this. Okay, this should be Got it. Because it's not a named export, we have to use it like this. If it was a named export, this is a default export. That's why we have to use it like this. If it was a named export, we should use it until we press this. Now we have imported this app object, but inside the app object, I want to use this trees. But in order to use that, we need to import this trees context. But we haven't added any data to this trees context. So how do I add the data to this trees context? Means like this. We have to give value. We are going to use this trees inside. What this means is trees colon trees. So this trees context object will now have an object called trees inside it, and that will have this is nothing but declaring this. And just for simplicity, I'm going to remove this, and this is the name will be assumed from the variable name. So this is an object. The trees context will now have an object called trees inside it. So now inside the app component, I can use the trees context and get the trees, number of trees, what all trees are available. This is without passing down the arguments. This trees are object, we are not passing down the child hierarchy because we are using it in the provider, context provider. So we are using it as a context. In order to use this trees context outside of this particular file, I need to make sure that it is exported. In this trees context, I'm going to import it in app.js. And for that, I will do import this. This is a named export because it's not a default export. We have to use it inside the places, this context from dot slash. So dot slash index we can do, but it's nothing but using dot slash. So just use dot slash. It will assume that it is from dot index.js. That's the default. So this trees context, I have to use it under use context. Let's define trees object. Extract the trees object from the context. How do I use it? Means use context of trees context. We now have trees context imported, but we haven't imported use context. Let's import it from other React. Import use context from here. Now trees object is available. If I just do console log of trees, and see what it has. You can see the trees object has 4 elements, all the trees available. So now we can use that trees object in this. Yes, we create an unordered list, and then for each tree we will create a list of list element. So trees, tree in object, and we will use tree.type. So now we see that we have a one key. Every iterable object should have a key in it. So I will have to have key here that says tree.id, the unique object to identify this specific element. Now running is gone. So this is how we use context. So this type of context, what we did here is we defined a global context that is available to the entire application and wrap this app component inside the context provider. While creating the context provider, we have initialized the values with whatever values. This context object can have multiple values, any number of application level configurations. Let's say stuff is streams, we can have settings, entire application level settings. It can be an array or an object. So this can have trees and settings. Let's say what is a theme you want to use, black theme you want to use. And inside this app, we can actually use this. We have theme, theme currently is not initialized. Settings. Actually, this is settings. We should extract into settings. And we have to do settings.theme. Black theme. So based on these configuration settings, we can actually customize our application entirely. So global application level settings, we can actually put it under the context object. And this can be changed also. Let's say I have one more element, let's say function called change theme. And new theme. And set. Basically, in order to use this kind of approach, we have to make sure that this is a constant state variable. The settings and theme should be state variables in order to change the theme dynamically. So let's not go there. The advantage of having this context is that we have global values available to the entire application without passing down these arguments like this. All the event handlers, all that, we don't need to pass it down the hierarchy. Any object at any level can extract the global properties as long as it is wrapped under the provider, context provider. And each part of the application can have its own providers and its own context. So one context can wrap another context. So let's say left side of the application has another context, can have. Yeah. Now let's use this knowledge that we got from context and use it in the fetching of data. We will define one more custom hook called use fetch that will allow us to fetch data from remote servers. And right now we have been implementing everything in useFetch. Let's extract that into some component called useFetch. Is again, this is the last lesson in hooks. So usually what we will handle in requests is if the data isn't available. So initially when the application loads, we don't have any data available yet, but it is loaded. And second thing, once we get the data, if we get the data, what has to happen? And third thing is if there is an error. These three scenarios we need to handle whenever we are sending requests to a remote server. The data isn't available yet, but actually we have sent the request and we are waiting for a response from the server to come. And then once we get the data, whether it is success or failure. And if there is an error, what has to happen? So all these three states we need to represent in the fetch mechanism. Let's import use state and use effect. Basically, use effect will be used for sending requests. Inside the use effect, we are going to send requests. And we will export this function called use fetch as a hook. And this returns something. We'll come back to that later. So this use fetch, what I need to fetch. So it should accept a parameter URI. So first thing, we need a state variable for storing the data that we fetch from the remote server. Let's define that. It's saying that it is data and a set data method for updating the data. Use it as use state. And initially, it doesn't have anything. By default, it can be null. And then we need a state to represent whether the data is getting loaded or not. Loading, whether we are waiting for the server to respond or not. Loading or set loading. And for that, we will use state. And initially, the loading state will be true because as soon as the use fetch is called, we're actually going to send the request immediately. And we'll be waiting on that. If there is a failure, we'll set it to false. If there is a success also, we'll set it to false. And we need a state variable to store if there is an error. So all these three things we need to inform to whoever is calling this use fetch hook. So inside this use fetch hook, we are going to use use effect. So we can actually use any number of other hooks inside our custom hooks. So use effect will first accept a function and then a set of state variables that this use effect depends on. So basically, whenever this URI changes, we need to send this request or run this use effect. So inside this use effect, we are going to do a fetch call. But before this, we need to validate if the URI is empty or not. If there is no URI or somebody sends invalid URI, we have to return it without doing anything. If not URI, just return. This is just a shortcut. We can actually do it with this approach also. And there is one shortcut in programming. We don't need to enclose a statement in brackets if it is only one statement. We can actually eliminate this part and do return. So this if condition to console log, right? This actually is one single statement. We don't need to wrap this up in a opening and closing brackets. We can just remove these brackets and use it like this. So similarly, for else also, you can do the same thing. If something, we just is do this. We don't need the extra brackets. So that's what we are using here. If not URI is return. And if it is not, so the next statement will not proceed if this is true. If return happens, the program does not continue executing these next lines. So it's safe to do. Instead of putting it as under else, we can just continue without the else. If we are returning here, that actually means whatever we put underneath it is all going to be the else part. So fetch the URI here, and then we will do a dot then. Something similar we got earlier. It will get the response. Let's say, make sure that this is response, and we will do response of JSON. This is standard approach. Then we will do set data here. It's nothing but receiving data and then doing a set data of t. So we can just replace this entire thing with set data function directly. And then we have to set the loading to false because we have done getting the data and we have already set the data. We can actually make sure that this is loading is set to false. Set loading as false. Because as soon as we initialize this use fetch, we are setting this loading to true. So as soon as we are done with the data fetching, we need to make sure that it is loading is set to false. And one last thing, if something happens, something bad happens, it will catch this error here. So when some error happens, we have to set the error. We can actually receive that in a value and set error to errors or something like this. Something like this. Instead of doing it this way, we can, just like we did the data, we can do it the same thing with errors as well. Automatically, this set error will be called with whatever error that part is in. And at the end, we have to pass in all this data, loading and error. First thing we'll pass is loading, whether loading or not, and we'll send data and error. Next time, whenever we are trying to fetch some data, we can use this use fetch instead of doing it ourselves in our implementing our own use of it. We don't have to do that anymore. We can use this fetch directly. So let's try doing that. So inside the app.js, we'll use that. In this, let's define a constant loading data and errors. We are going to use fetch, and it automatically imported this use fetch. We don't need these two. And use fetch is going to accept one URL. So this time we are going to pass in api.github.com/users/username. So username, I can give a value, but I want to define a parameter here for login. I'm going to use that value here, which user we want to get the information for. So this login is currently undefined. We have to pass in this login from our index.js. We do that in a few minutes. We now are able to fetch data for this particular URL, and we have to display that. If it is loading, we will just display page is loading. It's fine, loading. So if you see reload and go, just for a second, it showed that loading and right away, because this had an error. And let's say if error is not known or if it is true, return the error here. So this time we are going to use a free tag to actually identify what the error is. JSON.string define of errors. We just print the default error if that is any. And even that is not available because it's not an error. It is 404 response. If ultimately, if we have the data, then we will display that data. Yes. Before doing that, we'll just determine division. In it, we just see what the response is, and then we will modify. So we define our data. So just print the raw JSON. And for this, we actually need to pass in this login. So basically, the response came back as not found, URL as undefined for of the response. We actually pass in this login data that we will pass in as from here. Index.js, we will pass in login parameter as my username. And now it gets the information for that user. And let's do one thing. This is not pretty printing. We will just do some manipulation there. And let's use null NP. This is for formatting the JSON data, just like this. Even this, we can actually use these parameters. Two is the indentation. Null this. So we can refer to the documentation. Don't know that. For pretty printing, these two parameters, we can. This is called pretty printing. Without this, it was showing in one single line. And this is better approach. Now we have the data that is being fetched. We can actually now show, instead of this retag, we can actually show the data in a more user-friendly fashion. Just comment out this part. I'll use, let's keep it for now. I'm going to use the image, the file image of the URL. Source, image source, I'm going to use as data dot and we will set alt property data.login. And I don't see the other type. Open it. Let's see. Image. I think that's because the avatar is coming after this. Yeah. That remove this. Okay, let's zoom out. And now I can see the profile image. And let's print the name and username register. Let's print data.login, which is the username of this. This is the username. And if the name and location are available, we can actually display them. So data item, use paragraph tag, data item. It's not available because name is not set. Name is not, that's why it's not shown. So making sure that it doesn't render, we have to see if data.name exists and then display name. Data.location exists alias location. You can try with your own GitHub profile. History. So that's about our hooks.